Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to Capturing 0 Days Exploits with Perfectly Placed Hardware Traps. You are in the Jasmine Ballroom, and this presentation is by Cody Pierce, Matt Spisak, and Kenneth Fitch. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Please stop by the business hall located in Bayside AB during the day, and for the welcome reception from 5:30 to 9 tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is on in the Palm Foyer on level 3, and join us for the Pony Awards in Mandalay Bay BCD at 6:30. Thanks for putting your phones on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing while you're waiting for your voicemail to pick it up. And with that, let's get started.
Hello. Guess get this mic straight. Good morning, everybody. As she introduced us, we're going to be talking about capturing zero-day exploits with perfectly placed hardware traps. It's kind of a mouthful, but we're going to step through all of it and walk through it. I'm Cody Pierce. I'm a director of vulnerability research at Endgame, and with me and presenting with me are Matt Spisak and Kenneth Fitch, who are also vulnerability researchers at Endgame. And let's dive right in. So, we're going to be talking about two main things, and that's hardware-assisted control flow integrity, and they kind of work independently, but we're going to combine them throughout the talk to show you that our research comes out with some pretty strong detection. I'm going to just kind of introduce some of the topics at a high level, and these guys are going to really drill down into the technical aspect of it. So first, to kind of set the stage on where we started with our research and why we went down this path. As exploit writers and as having a lot of experience in exploitation and vulnerability research, we know that exploitation is increasingly more sophisticated. It's very dynamic, like all of security. It's inherently creative. And so that's one of the maybe differences in vulnerabilities and exploitation, that it's hard to plan for the creativity of an exploit writer or an exploit in something like the security development lifecycle, where you can model, you can validate and verify, you can do a good job of doing code reviews and things of that nature. But it's very hard to kind of flip that and say, how would I exploit this bug if I found it or if someone else found it? And we think that kind of adds to the dynamic nature of exploitation, and why it's interesting, and why it's also hard to provide defenses and protections for it. And finally, as far as an attacker versus a defender, a well-financed attacker with 0 days that is advanced in exploitation is a very, very hard adversary, because of how much leverage and how much control they might have over the program that you're trying to defend. So this is kind of something I came up with to demonstrate that we have kill chains, we have all these stages of persistence and whatnot. It actually happens in exploitation as well. There's different phases. So as an exploit begins, it goes through these phases and finally ends in persistence or backdoor malware actually being put to disk or memory and executed. And so this is to illuminate really what we kind of see as under the hood at a high level, what happens in an exploit as it runs. So you have these three areas. I'm not going to talk too much about pre-exploitation. I find it incredibly difficult to try to defend on the pre-exploitation side, because things like software identification they happen so often that your false positive rates are going to be extremely high. So the final two is the exploitation phase, where this is the point when the attacker is really going from maybe benign to malicious, or starting to overtake the program, and their exploit is really starting to groom the heap, starting to prepare to trigger a vulnerability, trigger that, defeat ASLR, leak memory, and then the bottom one is code execution. So they've prepped the environment, they're about to execute their payload, whether that's a ROP chain or whatever. And that takes us to the post-exploitation stage, and that's where you have return-oriented programming, you have your payload executing. COE is something that we call continuation of execution. It's where they repair the process so it doesn't crash and alert a user. And then persistence, and persistence is starting to really get into malware and looking for PE and executables and stuff. And so for what we're going to be talking about, and where we think there's a lot of strength, is going towards this exploitation phase, and specifically code execution. And Matt will dig into the details of what that looks like. But basically what we're saying is we want to really stick to early detection and detection at this layer, because it gives us, we still maintain the high ground as far as a defender when it comes to exploitation. We'll show a little bit later that once you get into return-oriented programming, payload execution, you're kind of fighting on the same ground as an attacker. So I'm going to introduce some of the high-level concepts that we'll be talking about. First one is the hardware assistance piece, 2Rs. There's a couple of things we're going to be using that are in the microarchitecture of the processor, and these are to highlight kind of what we'll be digging into a little bit. Obviously, we have the CPU core everybody's familiar with. We're going to talk about the performance monitoring unit, which gives us the perfectly placed trap portion of our long title, and the branch prediction unit. So the first thing to really go over at a high level is the performance monitoring unit. This is a unit in the architecture that is historically been designed for debugging, optimization, to get performance events out of a running system. And they're very low level. There's dozens and dozens of them. And what developers do is they're able to measure how their program executes, how many cache flushes, things of that nature, so that they can go back and fine tune these things. And this is a slide with just some of them. Again, there's dozens, clock cycles and whatnot. And you can refer to the Intel manual if you want to really get crazy with them. But what we're really kind of basing our inspiration off of is a performance monitoring unit as a security device, and no longer just a device for developers to optimize code. And this is some of the prior art and prior research that was really inspiring to us, that came up with a novel idea of using the performance monitoring unit as a security tool for certain things. And this first one was the first one we could kind of find that started to put these building blocks in place. And they built upon that and some follow-on research. And then over the last few years, people have been kind of getting more into this, using different hardware features for exploit prevention. K-Bouncer is a really popular one. Microsoft hosted a Blue Hat prize, and they won the top prize for that. And then the next one that was in a Threads talk. But then these are focused more on the ROP side of things. But again, this kind of got us really pumped about the idea and what we could do with it as a security device. So the next one to talk about is the branch prediction unit. The branch prediction unit is another feature, just like the performance monitoring unit. This one's a lot more opaque, and it's not available to program or to really touch. In fact, it's kind of a black box. But the purpose of it is to predict branches. And again, back to just making systems more performant. Intel, AMD, all those people with these highly multi-cores, multi-threads, all these things need to make the systems more and more efficient just to get the most out of them. And so the branch prediction unit is a fairly large part of that. And what it does is it makes the pipelining of instructions more efficient. So anytime you have a execution on multiple processors, you have to cache instructions or your performance is terrible. And so what the branch prediction unit is, we'll try to pre-cache instructions so that when a branch happens, which can be 20% of code in a C++ application, it's already predicted it, it's already pumped that pipeline, and it's ready to go. If it mispredicts, it flushes the cache, and it's a really bad performance thing. So again, it's kind of a black box, and so I've included a little more about it.
2 fully symmetric integer units, that's twice the G4. 2 load and store units, twice the G4, and massive branch prediction logic, which I don't know what it does, predicts branches. I don't know, but it's a good thing.
That's how we felt about it, trying to dig into Intel manuals, and it's good to know Steve Jobs said it much better than I could have. So all of these kind of work in concert, right? Like we're using hardware features, but there's so many hardware features that we're using, and it's all the purpose of the next piece. But again, these guys will go into technical detail. So just to represent the system here. And then the next piece is control flow integrity. So if we have the hardware piece, the control flow integrity is kind of the software piece. And what we want to do with control flow integrity, just some background, is it's to enforce legitimate control flow. And it's traditionally done with compiler instrumentation. There's many different policies that you can enforce in control flow integrity, but the basic idea is you want to just validate all control flow. It's a side effect of exploits that we see all the time, and it's a constant theme, so it's a great place to try to build up a defense there to do detection and prevention. So in normal, without control flow integrity, you'll have a control flow transfer jump to a destination, and for an exploit writer, the destination is all a virtual memory that's executable. So there's no limitation on what they can call in a lot of cases, and that's where they really get the creativity. And what CFI hopes to do is enforce a policy. So when there is a control flow change, there's a policy that checks that it's valid, and if it is, it continues, and if it's not, you have an opportunity as a defender to do something about it, and that may be terminate, alert, or whatnot, dump memory, things of that nature. And so there's a lot of CFI implementations. It's not a new concept. It's been in academic research for a long time. Vendors are starting to really kind of push on doing control flow implementations. Some that you may have heard of is Control Flow Guard from Microsoft. Intel just released a specification hoping to get some support on their control flow enforcement technology. And then the PAX team are always coming out with really great mitigations and preventions, are doing it as well. So they're, with their indirect control transfer protection, they're able to enforce some CFI policies. But what we where we started our research is we knew that there was kind of a gap, right? These all require recompilation. Most of them require new software, new kernels in the latest operating system. So, for instance, Control Flow Guard is much better on Windows 10, or it was when it came out. And some of these are not cross-platform. So we found this as a really green field for us to do some research that would kind of elevate this into a dynamic runtime CFI using these hardware features. So some of the parameters we set out with were to not have access to source code, to be cross-platform, to support 32 and 64-bit, and no pre-processing of binaries. A lot of the research wants to do something called control flow graph reconstruction, and it's a really hard problem. So it's kind of better to not try to do that. It doesn't scale well. And then not be specific to certain bug classes or exploit techniques like ROT. And finally, since we were using hardware features, and we didn't want the overhead to be something that was unusable in the real world. And finally, before we get into the details of all this, I wanted to talk about RealWorld Verification. We're huge fans of using real exploits, real software, and just as much data as we can get. There's an incredibly rich amount of data in the exploit world that we can harvest to actually test some of these ideas as we begin to research them and prove them out. And Kenneth will get into some of that, but these are some of the areas where we drew from. Cyber Grand Challenge publishes all of their exploits and all their vulnerable programs, so you can check them out there. Research community like Project Zero, all great resources to test out these types of things. So with that, I'll get over to Matt, who's going to get into the details of CFI.
All right, yes. So I'm going to talk about kind of our overall, the overall approach to our research, and it kind of stems from the main hypothesis that, a hijacked indirect branch is almost always going to be mispredicted by the branch prediction unit. Since the branch prediction unit is built largely on kind of a branch history, and so the fact that this call site is now jumping to some new address is going to be mispredicted. And so that was kind of the hypothesis we were focused on, and a lot of the prior art has been focused more on ROP, as Cody mentioned, and so we instead wanted to focus on validating the non-return indirect branches. So you could have an indirect jump, an indirect call, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But kind of the overall approach we went with was we're going to use the PMU to trap every single time a mispredicted indirect call occurs, and then use our interrupt service routine to make the decision whether the branch is valid or not. And so And we started out working with Linux 64-bit just because it's much easier to work on Linux. And so kind of a visual high-level picture of the same thing. And we'll step through each of these, but we're using the hardware-assisted piece. The PMUs giving us that callback at these strategic times. Our interrupt service routine is going to do some sort of analysis, and then we'll ignore the user mode part because we're going to get into that. But if you're like us, one of your kind of first questions might be, all right, isn't this going to be very expensive? You're interrupting all these mispredicted branches. And so, and through our research, we found that it's not as bad as we initially thought. And with branch prediction unit improving through each generation of the Intel's microarchitecture, there's sort of a direct correlation there between how many mispredicts and what the overhead would be. But hopefully you'll see in the slides that overhead is not that bad. And kind of another way to think about it, if you compare some of these different CFI approaches, there's obviously pros and cons to everything. Cody noted we did not want to require recompilation of source code. But kind of a different way to think about it is that all of these approaches have overhead. Even if you're compiling in 10 instructions to validate some sort of call, that's 10 added instructions. And since we're using mispredicted branches, that's only going to be a subset, a fraction of times at that call site, whereas with a compiled in or patched in CFI, that added overhead is going to be applied every single time that call site is invoked. But so walking through each of these, so with respect to the PMU, there's been a lot of great talks, threads a couple years ago, Black Hat last year, which really highlighted how to write code to control the PMU. So we're not going to go into that, but at a high level, there's a handful of model-specific registers that you need in order to configure and access the counters and enable interrupts and clear interrupts. But the Intel manual is also a great reference for the PMU. And as far as indirect branches, there's a couple that jump out in the manual. There's branches mispredicted retired and branches mispredicted executed. The main difference is the retired one is a little bit more precise, so we opted for that particular event because more precise means fewer interrupts, which means better performance. Sure. So the next part then is our interrupt service routine, which is kind of making the decision or doing something once these interrupts occur. And so to kind of, if you're not familiar with the PMU, you might, visualizing how this all works sometimes is useful, but we see we've got some assembly here, and in the left-hand column we've got our counter value, which we've set at -1. Each time the counter overflows, that's when the interrupt will be delivered. And so in an ideal world here, we're counting mispredicted indirect calls, and we see this indirect call occurs, the counter overflows, the interrupts delivered, and then our ISR could just grab the saved instruction pointer from the thread that was interrupted. The problem is that's not how it works all the time. So something called interrupt instruction skid can occur where and it can be highly dependent on what's going on in the system, but as well as where the overflow occurs in the instruction pipeline. But what you'll often see is the counter overflows, and then some number of instructions later, the interrupt will finally be delivered. And so because of this, we can't just use the saved instruction pointer, because there's no guarantee that saved instruction pointer was actually the branch destination for the indirect call that was just mispredicted. And so the bottom line is we need a more precise way to get that branch target address. And that's where the Intel's last branch recording comes into play. And the LBR was kind of the main focus of the K-Bouncer paper that Cody mentioned. And same with the PMU, the LBR is controlled and accessed through a handful of MSRs. A couple, the LBR is a circular stack that just logs the most recent branches, and a couple of the MSRs to note a LBR select allows you to control what type of branches are logged, and the top of stack gives you the offset into the LBR register, so you know which was the actual last branch that occurred. And so with that LBR select MSR, I've highlighted the bits here that we can set to 0, so that we can basically tell the LBR to only log branches, indirect calls that occur in user mode. And then, interestingly, in the LBR registers from the actual from and to addresses, in the from we see this mispredicted bit, which we can use to sort of validate that, yeah, the branch was actually mispredicted, because we found that on occasion you'll get a mispredicted branch, and either the branch wasn't actually mispredicted or it wasn't logged to the LBR because it wasn't the appropriate call type. So once we add the LBR, then we can take care of this instruction skid issue. So the next time we see this, some number of instructions past the entry point to foo here, we finally get our interrupt delivered, and our ISR can then just read the top of the stack off the LBR. We see this entry jumping from 1007 to foo, the address of foo, and then we can take that address and apply our CFI policy, whatever that may be, to validate the destination. So at this point, we had a system in place that could basically trap and capture the branches that were mispredicted. So what do we do with that data? So our first iteration, we basically just piped all of these branches to user space and dumped them into a big pile of branches, and then so that we could kind of post-process the data. And we really wanted to work with real-world data. So kind of our first success was we took one of the CyberGrand Challenge samples. This particular sample is a use after free, and we profiled our system on this particular program, and we can see at the end this mispredicted branch, which actually denotes the hijacked call. We can see it trying to jump to 414141, and so from there, we can look up and see the assembly from the from address to see what the call was and the appropriate source code. But the bottom line here for us was this was kind of a validation that we're moving down the right path. So from there, we wanted to work with a little bit more real world data. So we chose a proof of concept exploit for a flash bug from Chris Evans. And at the time, we were working with Linux 64-bit, and this particular POC worked quite well on 64-bit Linux. So we went through the same procedure. We profiled Chrome, captured all the mispredicted indirect calls, but then when we kind of looked through the data, we didn't see the hijack showing up. And as it turns out, the reason was, as you can see, his particular trigger was on write bytes, which actually resulted in an indirect jump being mispredicted. And so this kind of inspired us to explore a couple things. So first, we kind of rewrote the POC to instead hijack different virtual functions for the byte array object. And then this basically gave us two things. One, it gave us a bunch of unique data points. So one vulnerability, 16 data points of unique call site hijacks. But it also kind of gave us some insight into how often are we going to deal with an indirect jump being hijacked versus a call. And so from there, we became kind of curious on just in general. So we applied some IDA Python processing to some popular binaries on Windows and Linux that you would think would be where a lot of call site or control flow hijacks would originate from, JavaScript, Flash binaries. And as we found, indirect jumps are a little bit more prevalent on Windows. On Linux, and that really, we do need to consider indirect jumps as a potential hijackable call site. In this particular talk, we're just going to be talking about indirect calls, but we thought it was kind of interesting to kind of plot that data. So now we had a system where we were capturing these mispredicted branches, storing them, and kind of post-processing them to see whether our hijacked call was collected or not. And so this is where we decided, can we do this in real time and sort of query some sort of waitlist and decide whether the branch destination is a branch destination that should occur from a indirect call site. And so we used Firefox with the Dromeo JavaScript benchmark to generate a ton of data. So we had like 160 some million branches, and we basically iterated on that data over and over until we could sort of categorize every branch. And so what we came up with was about 2/3 of that data came from functions that you could find in the relocation section, which would be expected from an indirect call. We saw some from exports, some branch data that wasn't actually a mispredicted branch, and then something we call callbacks, which are basically code pointers that are being passed in as arguments to another function. And then finally a chunk of branches that are going to a JIT code page because this is JavaScript. But the important thing here was that we were able to basically take 167 million branches and whittle it down to 0 that we couldn't account for. And so from there, we decided to try to do this in real time. So in the kernel, we would build this whitelist, and every time a mispredicted indirect call occurred, we would validate the destination address to make sure it was a legit destination. And so basically our whitelist generation, each time a new image is loaded into a process we're protecting, we want to find all code pointer addresses present in that image. So scanning relocations, exports, the callbacks I was referring to, and where a code pointer is basically some sort of address that's pointing into the text section. So once we had the system in place, we were pretty satisfied with the results on Linux, but Kenny's going to come up and talk about some of the headaches we encountered when we tried to move to Windows 64-bit.
Thanks. Yeah, so now that Matt's covered some of the cover our methodology pretty much, I'm going to talk about some of the particular implementation challenges we had when we tried to take this technique and make it into a workable prototype. And I'm really going to highlight 3 basic things: receiving the PMU interrupts, and then clearing them once we've received them, and the issue of thread tracking, which turned out to be a pretty big deal for us. So receiving PMU interrupts on Windows requires registering with the interrupt controller to get to have our handler be called when the interrupt happens. And we knew that we could modify the IDT directly, but we also knew that on at least 64-bit Windows, PatchGuard was not going to like that and going to block us. So we did a little digging, and we found a mostly undocumented kernel routine in HAL DLL called help set system information. And if you pass an information class of HAL profile source interrupt handler into it, it actually has an internal, really nice mechanism for registering a callback specifically for performance interrupts. And it's reachable through HAL dispatch table, so there's a reliable way to get to that unexported function. And here's just a little code snippet of what that looks like. I'm not going to dig into it, but it's really just a basic callback registration. And here's some examples of how you would use it. It's very simple. You just create a buffer, passing your function pointer into the function, and it registers it, and then deregistering is the same thing. So once we started this, we were able to register the interrupt. We were getting branch misprediction interrupts correctly in our handler, but we got one the first time, and we realized that we actually have to clear the interrupt and tell the interrupt controller that we had received it and to continue receiving interrupts in the future. And it turned out this was a little bit tricky. It required some work and some research to figure out how to do it correctly, specifically because there are 2 different interfaces the Intel has defined, X8PIC and X2 APIC, and which one is used by Windows depends on both their availability and which version of Windows you're running. So for X8PIC, it's been around a long time, Pentium 4, and it's the default on Windows 7. And the registers in the APIC are accessed through physical memory. So we were required to map that physical memory into the virtual address space so we could use it. We used MMAP IO space to do that and wrote to it. And that was a little bit of work to get that working. X2 APIC, which is fairly new and is used on Windows 8 through 10, actually was really easy. It uses MSRs and to talk to the interrupt controller. So that was pretty trivial. We just do a write MSR call to do it. And to do the same thing on Linux for comparison was trivial. There's a call, registry NMI handler in the Linux kernel that lets you register it and deregister it. And it was really straightforward. This is actually the first one we did. And it took us maybe a day or two to do. And the last major issue, and the one we spent most of our time on, was the idea of thread tracking. So the PMU doesn't have any awareness of threads on the system or process context. It's always running until you turn it off. And that didn't work for us. We don't want to monitor the entire system all the time. We only want to monitor certain key threads like browsers and Office applications, things like that. So we needed a way to limit our monitoring to just particular processes. And on Windows, it wasn't straightforward at all. We actually spent quite a bit of time on trying to come up with a solution for this. There's no explicit mechanism in Windows to say, hey, let me know when a context switch happens and a new thread gets put onto a processor, or when that context switch is ended, or when the thread goes off of the processor. So that was a major problem. We have no way of knowing when that's happening, and we had to have a way to track the threads as they were being shifted in and out. So the eventual approach we came to uses asynchronous procedure calls. So according to Microsoft, when an APC is queued to a thread, the system issues a software interrupt. The next time the thread is scheduled, it will run the APC function. So in other words, it's essentially a queue of functions that get executed at first availability, which turns out to be when the context switch happens and the thread gets scheduled for the processor. So that was perfect. That was exactly what we were looking for. It's basically a callback to let us know when the context switch happens. But it turns out it wasn't quite that simple. We don't want to track all the threads on the system to know when they get swapped out. We really don't want to know when the ones we care about happen. And there was no way to know when the thread gets swapped out as opposed to in. And also as a secondary difficulty, if you try to register an APC handler from inside an APC handler for the current thread, it goes into an infinite loop and locks everything up. So the final solution we arrived at was to schedule a kernel APC for every thread that we want to track, and then we configure the PMU to trap all the mispredicted branches when that context switch happens. And we continue to monitor, we continue to apply our protections until we see an interrupt for the wrong thread. And at that point, we know that our original thread has been swapped out. We can turn off the PMU, stop monitoring, and make sure that the APC is rescheduled for the process we care about. And so when it comes back in, we'll know. And we continue doing that until we don't monitor anymore. And this is a diagram of how it works. It's a little dense, but basically the yellow lines are the APCs that are happening. The blocks are the different thread quantum that are happening on the processor. And the vertical lines are the interrupts that occur. So the red ones are when, like, if we see an interrupt for calc, then we don't care. We immediately stop monitoring, turn off the PMU, and wait for a new APC to happen. And to contrast again, for Linux, this was pretty trivial. It was nice enough to give us registrations for callbacks when something gets scheduled in or scheduled out. So compared to the hours and hours and hours of work on Windows, this was just a matter of a little bit of work on Linux. And we were pretty happy about that. So the second section I'm going to talk about are the results. Specifically, what was the performance overhead and what was the actual efficacy of this? How did it do in detecting exploits? So as Matt mentioned earlier, we expected to get a lot of interrupts, one for every mispredicted branch that happens. We initially weren't sure how many that was going to be or what kind of overhead it was going to generate for the processor when we were doing it. And there was also, the small APC overhead for the monitoring, switching on and off. And we didn't even know if this was going to be feasible at first. So we did some testing. And the main result we saw from the testing was that as the microarchitecture progressed, our theory is that the branch misprediction unit gets better. So the interrupts went down over time with different microarchitectures. So with Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge, they're about the same. This is for one run of Google's Octane JavaScript benchmark. So it saw between 13 and 14 million interrupts over maybe 15, 20 seconds. And Haswell and Skylake went down considerably. So the end result of all the performance testing, we ran Passmark and Google Octane under Internet Explorer. And we chose EMET as sort of the industry standard protection product that was sort of comparable to what we were doing, just to see what an acceptable level overhead was that we compare ourselves to. And for Passmark, we saw about a 9% overhead for HACFI, and EMET was about 3%, and that's about what we expected. And for Octane, we were about 7%, EMET was 20%. And we were a little surprised by that, but the conclusion we've drawn is that the interrupts really, the way the monitoring happens is different. So it varies widely between what different applications or code you're running in the application. So the performance overhead shifts depending on what you're doing considerably, but generally we see it about 10% or less. And subjectively, we run this on our own systems, under browsers and Office applications and things, and we really don't notice any system slowdown. It's perfectly usable. We can stream video and do pretty much anything we want. So now that we knew that the performance was acceptable and we could actually use this, we needed to test to see how it actually performed against exploits. So we went to Metasploit. We grabbed a handful of Metasploit modules and tested them, and after just a little bit of tweaking, we found that we detected 100% of the modules, which was awesome. But we decided that testing against Metasploit wasn't really a good test because a lot of the Metasploit modules share a similar method of exploitation. And what we really wanted, because of the way the CFI works, is a diversity of techniques instead of exploits. We don't care about the vulnerability as much as how it's exploited. So we went to VirusTotal and we started collecting some samples. And we sort of decided somewhat arbitrarily to focus on exploit kits. So we pulled 48 different VirusTotal samples from 7 different exploit kits, and that was about 20 unique CVEs for those 48 samples. And we ran an automated test bed to test CFI against all of them. And we also did a little analysis on each sample, and we binned them into 3 different techniques, general categories. Ones that used ROP, ones that used what we're calling a ROP-less technique A, which is it's a flash exploitation technique that uses a wrapper of vulture protect to mark shellcode as executable and jump to it, so it's not a traditional ROP exploit. And technique B, which is very similar, but it uses method.apply and action script. It was pioneered by Vitaly Toropov. And Cody's going to go into a little more detail with case studies on how these work later. So the final detection matrix, we were able to detect 95% of ROP, which is 37 of the 48 samples we tested. We had 1 technique A sample, which we detected, and 10 technique B, which we detected 100% too. And EMET did fantastic at ROP, but it didn't detect any of the ROP-less techniques. And the same data split by bug class. We had more or less 100%. For some of the other ones, we had 83.3%, and that was really more of the exploitation technique instead of the actual vulnerability. And I think the takeaway from this is that the vulnerability doesn't matter for this technique. It's really what happens after the vulnerability has been triggered. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cody to go over some case studies.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, we're just going to walk through a couple of case studies real quickly so we have time for questions and whatnot. But this is, again, when we look at ROP, and Kenny mentioned ROP-less A and B, these are things that we're seeing trending over the last 2 years that are becoming more prevalent than the traditional ROP-based exploitation techniques. And it was something that we really kind of were shooting for from the beginning to not just stick to certain old exploitation techniques. And so with the case studies, we wanted to kind of dive a little bit deeper using the first one as a classic ROP technique. And you can see from the instructions here, this is a double free in Jscript out of the Magnitude exploit kit, and this is condensed of what happens when that exploit starts. And if you remember, I was talking in the beginning about the phases This top is going to be the initial code execution, control flow hijack, and then you get into the traditional ROP gadget of a stack pivot and some COE stuff, and then eventually virtual protect on the payload to begin that process. And with our system and what we've been discussing, we see that when we ran our testing that Kenny mentioned, we actually detect that branch. And so we're able to detect it before it gets into the later stages of the exploitation phase. EMET, again, EMET's the industry standard. It's recommended in the DoD. It's great. We use it because it's industry standard, but we wanted to show it as a comparison to what we're talking about with more aggressive early detection. And they pick it up eventually in the virtual protect stub because they're hook based, so they're waiting for a call to happen so that they can then instrument. We're real-time dynamic, so as soon as a indirect happens, we're checking, which is earlier. In our basketball analogy here, where we're getting the block, but Tim Duncan as EMET is going to get it, but he may just be a little bit behind. And so then we get into the ROP list techniques, and this is the last case study that we're going to quickly walk through, but it highlights that this is a different bug class. It's a heap overflow. It's Flash. It's also found in many exploit kits, but they're not using ROP, so they are using a technique that is hard for hook-based prevention to understand. And there's two control flow hijacks, which we kind of were surprised by, but it makes sense when we look at it. There's actually a control flow hijack at the very beginning when the bug is triggered, but then there's a control flow hijack one that we can pick up with the jump to payload, which is abnormal, and it'll be mispredicted by the branch prediction unit. And this particular one actually bypasses EMET and some others, so we thought it would be an interesting one to show. And again, we go through and demonstrate that the initial control flow hijack is actually more related to the vulnerability, and that it is a first step before exploitation actually begins the process where they take over the application. And using the performance monitoring unit, we actually pick that up, and we can enforce our CFI policy. And unfortunately, this is showing the second one, but unfortunately on this one, EMET doesn't even pick it up, and it completely gets bypassed. So in our analogy here, they're kind of standing behind and not getting the block. And again, this is tongue in cheek. We're not really trying to pick on EMET too much, but we really do believe in early detection for a solid, unbypassable, or at least a resilient exploit defense. So some future work. It's not a silver bullet. There's no such thing. There's kind of work to be done to really flesh this out. Hypervisors are the biggest kind of barrier right now. The hypervisors like Zen don't support all the hardware features that we need. They support a lot of them. The big one is LBR and PMI and LBR events. So we did patch Zen. I wrote the patch for Zen to implement it, but after 1 minute running, it crashed horribly. So it's not an easy one, but it is kind of lacking there. And then the second one, you saw in Matt's pie chart that just-in-time code pages are difficult. And the reason that just-in-time code pages are difficult is because they're unbacked by a module. So it's hard to understand if they're legitimate, if an attacker has heap sprayed or something like that. And oftentimes they're just trampoline code, so they may be very small pieces of instructions. And that's a little bit difficult to pick out when you're trying to pick out some anomalies. So more research to be done there. And finally, to wrap, exploit defense is constantly evolving, like everything that we're doing in security. And so, we need to get earlier and better prevention and detection strategies. And, we're hoping this research kind of pushes some of that to leverage hardware. Compile time solutions are great, and by all means, it's something we have to do in a secure development perspective. But we think there's room for runtime defenses, dynamic defenses, things that just enforce CFI, all the time on branch mispredictions. And let's not be so focused on the techniques that we know about today. Let's think about, the core issue and the techniques that might come out later, or best case, just try to cut them off before they even have those opportunities. And kind of finally, the exploits will continue to look normal. We see it in malware, where they're starting to use malwareless sysadministration tools to execute code or whatever, and exploits will continue to do the same thing, where they continue to use legitimate code and reuse code. So on hardware-assisted control flow integrity, we're just huge fans of control flow integrity. We're huge fans of hardware. This was our research to try to bridge the two to make a real-time defense. And those CFI policies can get as complex as we want them. Again, we're competing with performance, so we do have a powerful place in the interrupt service routine to do additional checking. One thing is we don't add code to user land; it's all kernel, so there's a lot that we can do there. Finally, before we open up to questions, just some thanks. Some people in game: Aaron Lamb, Gabe Landau, and Andrea. And then Caffeine runs a great blog where he breaks down exploit kits, and we use that information a lot. So, and finally, fellow researchers on exploits and other vendors working on the problem. So we'll take a few minutes for 4 minutes for questions if anybody has them. I couldn't hear it. Can you say that again? What do you say? False positives. Oh, yeah, false positives. The false positives happen really when you're doing the call site validation. And so we've done rigorous testing to basically browse many websites, try as much as we can to be normal, like exercise the application like a user would. And many libraries and DLLs load, and our whitelist processing can pick out what's legitimate, and then we continue with that. And we haven't, we've seen some false positives, but they're actually surprisingly few and far between. So as long as you're able to identify the relocations and the legitimate call sites appropriately for an application in all the libraries, it's fairly low.
What microcontroller architectures did you explore specifically? I'm interested. Do you know your mechanisms would be available on an ARM processor?
Yeah, actually, thanks for the softball question. Matt did a talk at Recon that he could talk a little bit more for a minute or so about using it. The performance monitoring unit is on every microarchitecture outside of the really, really small commodity ones.
Yeah, so the overall approach applies to ARM. Some of the newer ARM v8 cores have events, in fact, focused on mispredicted indirect calls. The problem with ARM is that it doesn't have a last branch recording mechanism like Intel, so you would almost have to tie into one of the trace, either the embedded trace macrocell or program flow trace, if you could somehow combine those two pieces, so that, because the instruction skid problem also occurs on ARM, so that validating that, or I should say, getting that precise branch destination is the only kind of unsolved problem.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, good.